And whether Missouri changes how state taxes are collected could be up to you to decide as lawmakers debate whether to put the issue on the ballot in November. Now, currently, Missouri's income tax makes up more than half of the state's general revenue. A plan by Governor Mike Kehoe would phase all of that income tax out with an estimated date of 2031. In his plan, that revenue would be replaced by other taxes like on goods and services. Lawmakers are debating how if they would put that decision in the hands of voters. Now, here to sort all of this out for us, because, I mean, let's face it, tax law, not exactly straightforward, but we have Professor David Yaskovitz, right? Mm-hmm. And you are with the Southeast Missouri University, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. We're so happy to have you here. So your focus is economics. So sort this out for us. What does this mean for the average Missourian?
Mm-hmm. So right now, there's not much that's certain. There might be a proposal that voters might see that would eliminate the state income tax. Now, if there was an elimination, that's what we'll focus our discussion on. If there was an elimination of the state income tax, there would be a clear and immediate reduction in the tax obligations of your wage and salary tax payments. So immediately, the taxes you pay on wages and salaries would go down. As you mentioned, over half, over 60% of the general revenue in the state is from the individual income tax.
That's a big chunk.
Yeah, those are clear and immediate impacts that this would happen. So what's less clear is how would that budget hole be filled, and what would be some of the other strategies that lawmakers might seek to fill that hole.
Now, one thing that's been discussed is replacing that lost tax revenue with goods and services, like I suppose a sales tax. Would that make Missouri less competitive for, say, shoppers if you're going to go to Illinois or Missouri, and Missouri has a much higher tax rate? Would that potentially end up hurting Missouri?
Might depend on the shoppers as well. Mm-hmm. If you were to look at the numbers, in order to close that budget hole, if the income tax were eliminated, and if we're done solely on the sales tax, which is too strong of an assumption to make, mm-hmm. that sales tax would have to make 4 times as much as it's currently earning. So I think one of the less certain outcomes, but you could probably bank on it happening, if that makes sense, would be that sales taxes would probably be higher. Mm-hmm. It'd probably involve some combination of raising the rates of sales taxes, but also broadening the base on which activities, which goods and services are being taxed. Some of your viewers might have heard that there were suggestions to tax streaming services and digital products. That could be a part of that. Now, to your question, would that be something that would not be favorable to some consumers? What you'll probably hear is that when it comes to sales taxes, they tend to be disproportionately placed on those who don't make as much money. Mm-hmm. So those households would probably be disproportionately harmed by higher sales taxes. So yes, it could have an impact. Are people going to leave the state or drive to another state to do some of their purchases? If we're in Cape Girardeau, maybe. We're close to the border. If you're not, then you're probably less of an outcome.
Okay. Well, why might this be a concern for, I guess you just addressed, for folks on fixed incomes, because the tax burden is going to be shifting from the wealthier people who would pay more in income taxes versus the people who buy eggs, milk, bread, and pay more on that, right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sales taxes tend to be regressive. Mm-hmm. So that might be something that some viewers might view as negative, but it's another one of the costs that would become, or the trade-offs, I should really say, of eliminating an individual income tax. So something else to consider on the sales tax front. There's quite a bit of local revenue collected from sales taxes. So if the state were to stack on a higher tax rate on sales that apply to both taxable at the state level and taxable at the local level, there might be something that economists call the crowd-out effect, where having higher sales taxes imposed by the state might limit decisions by local governments to raise their sales taxes in the future, or the combination of the two might have an impact where it discourages consumption in general. So that's just, I'm not saying that would defeat any proposals, but that's a trade-off that would have to be considered.
Definitely a lot to consider at the ballot in November if it does go to voters. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much for your time coming in and sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And of course, we're going to continue to follow this story, so stick with Heartland News for a